As one Jewish banker and Illuminati patron, Amschel Rothschild, is known to have famously remarked, "Give me the control of a county's finances, and I care not who governs the country." This leads to communism in the end. The Jews hold all wealth and power and the Gentiles are reduced to total slavery. Ta global Jewry's one world order. The nations will gather to pay homage to the people of God. All the fortunes of nations will pass to the Jewish people. They will march captive behind the 234 Jewish people in chains and will prostrate themselves before them. Their kings will bring up their sons, and their princesses will nurse their children. The Jews will command the nations, they will summon peoples whom they do not even know them will hasten to them. The riches of the sea and the wealth of nations will come to the Jews of their own right. Any people of the kingdom who will not serve Israel will be destroyed. Isidore Loeb Le Literature de Pauvre dans la Bible. What were the effects of the subversion of Freemasonry by the Jews, within the organization? Masonry is based upon Judaism. Eliminate the teachings of Judaism from the Masonic ritual and what is left? The Jewish Tribune, New York, October 28, 1927. In the present nations, Freemasonry is only of benefit to the Jews. Theodor Herzl, founder and leader of World Zionism. We have founded many secret associations, which all work for our purpose, under our orders and our direction. One of the many triumphs of our Freemasonry is that those Gentiles who become members of our lodges should never suspect that we are using them to build their own jails, upon whose terraces we shall erect the throne of our universal King of the Jews, and should never know that we are commanding them to forge the chains of their own servility to our future King of the world. Opening speech made at the B'nai B'rith Convention in Paris, published in the Catholic Gazette, February 1936. Here it should be obvious why the Third Reich banned such organizations within Germany. They are organs of Jewish communism. Sources: 1. The Coming Gnostic Civilization by M. A. Pinkham. 235. The Jewish Origins of Christianity. The following are excerpts from The White Man's Bible and Nature's Eternal Religion, both written by Ben Klassen. Though written from an atheist perspective, one can readily see truths concerning the hoax of Christianity. The trouble is, atheists are unaware of psychic powers and how they can be used to make people fall for this lie. About 100 before Christ, a small Jewish sect, called the Essenes, originated around the area of the Dead Sea. This sect promoted ideas of self-debasement that were highly suicidal to those who embraced this creed. Toward the end of the 1st century CE, this teaching evolved into Christianity, but still a purely Jewish cult. It was regarded as a subversive and destructive movement by the mainstream of Jewish leaders and was opposed and persecuted by them. Among the persecutors of the Christian cult was one Saul of Tarsus, a Jew, who later became Christianity's Saint Paul. One day, while persecuting Jewish Christians, he conceived the brilliant idea of humbling and destroying the mighty Roman Empire by selling this suicidal creed, Christianity, to the Gentiles. This idea was the most significant turning point in history. No plague, series of plagues, wars, or disasters during the next 2,000 years has wreaked more horrible calamity on the white race of the world than what happened next. So well did Saul of Tarsus do his job that he was soon joined and backed by the entire Jewish network in selling these suicidal teachings to the Romans. The Jews went about it with a vengeance, feeding the Romans such idiotic and self-destructive ideas as love your enemies, turn the other cheek, sell all thou hast and give it to the poor, resist not evil, judge not, and much other suicidal advice. Christ never existed. Jesus Christ did not invent or found Christianity. All evidence that can be gleaned from a scholarly examination of authentic history points to an obvious conclusion: there never was any Jesus Christ roaming about in 30 AD or thereabouts teaching a new religion. The whole story was invented and concocted much later. It was patched together out of fables, myths, bits and pieces of other religions, until finally they had a movement going that pulled in the Roman Emperor Constantine. It was this Roman emperor, who had the mind of a criminal, had murdered his own wife and son, and thousands of others, who in the year 313 AD really put Christianity into business. The Romans, who had always been extremely tolerant to all religions, were now told by an edict of Emperor Constantine that Christianity was now the supreme religion of the empire to the exclusion of all others. The beginning of the Christian era found Rome near the height of her civilization. Her supremacy, in the then known world, was pretty much unchallenged, and it was the beginning of a long period of peace. To be specific, Pax Romana, Roman peace, lasted approximately 200 years beginning 236 with the reign of Caesar Augustus. Rome was highly literate. There were many great writers, scholars, historians, sculptors and painters, not to mention other outstanding men of philosophy and learning. Yet it is highly strange that despite the great commotion and fanfare that supposedly heralded the birth of Christ and also his crucifixion, according to Thebiable, we find not a single historian nor a single writer of the era who found time to detail note of it in their writings. Outside of the fabricated biblical writings, no Roman historian, no Roman writer, and no Roman playwriter, has left the slightest hint that he had the faintest awareness that this supposedly greatest of all greats was in their very midst and preaching what is claimed the greatest of all new Gospels, whereas Caesar left voluminous writings that are still extant today and can best studied by our high school boys and girls. Christ himself, who had supposed lithe greatest message to deliver to posterity that the world has ever known, left not the slightest scrap of paper on which he had written a single word. This, in fact, the biblical literature itself confirms and mentions only that once he did write in the sand. Today we can still study Cicero's great orations and writings. He has left over 800 letters behind that we can study to this day. We can study whole books of what Marcus Aurelius wrote, we can study what Aristotle wrote, what Plato wrote, and scores of others wrote that were contemporary with the first beginning of the Christian era, or preceded it. But strangely there is not a word that is in writing that can be attributed to Jesus Christ himself. Furthermore, the Greeks and the Romans of that era, and even previously and afterwards, had developed the art of sculpturing to a fine state. We can find busts of Cicero, of Caesar, of Marcus Aurelius and innumerable other Greek and Roman dignitaries and lesser lights, but nor one seemed to think it important enough to sculpture a likeness of Jesus Christ. And the reason undoubtedly is there was none to model at the time. There were undoubtedly numerous skilled artists and painters at that time, but again strangely enough none took the time or the interest to paint a likeness of this purportedly greatest of all teachers, who in fact was proclaimed the Son of God come to earth. But no painting was ever made of this man, who, we are told, gathered great multitudes around him and caused great consternation and fear even to King Herod of Judea himself. Now all of this is very, very strange, when, if, as the Bible claims, the birth of Jesus Christ was ushered in with great fanfare and great proclamations. Angels proclaimed his birth. An exceedingly bright star pointed to his place of birth. In Matthew 2:3, it says, when Herod, the king, had heard of these things he was troubled and all Jerusalem with him. We can hardly gather from this that no one is aware of the fact that the King of the Jews, the great Messiah, was born, for we are told in the preceding verse that the wise men came to King Herod himself saying, "Where is he that is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and we are come to worship him." Evidently the event was even lit up 237 with a bright star from heaven. In any case, King Herod, we are told in Matthew 3, was so worried that he sent the wise men to Bethlehem to search diligently for the young child to bring it to him, so he undoubtedly could have him put to death. As the story further unfolds, we learn that Joseph heard of this and quietly slipped out in the night, taking with him his wife, the young child and a donkey, and departed for Egypt. When Herod found out that he had been tricked, it says that he was exceedingly wroth and sent forth and slew all children that were in Bethlehem, and in all the coasts thereof, from 2 years old and under. Now this is a tremendously drastic act for a king to take, that is, to have murdered all the children in the land that were under 2 years of age. Again, we can hardly say that the birth of Jesus was unheralded, unannounced and unobserved, according to the story in the Bible. However, it is very, very strange that this act of Herod, as drastic and criminally harsh as it is nowhere else recorded in the histories or writings of any of the other numerous writers of the times. All we have is the claims of those people who wrote the New Testament. In fact, whoever wrote the New Testament invented so many claims that are inconsistent with the facts that they even made a rather glaring error by pulling King Herod into the story. History tells us that in the year 1 CE, when Christ was supposedly born, Herod had already been dead for 4 years. He could hardly been disturbed or very wroth about the birth of anybody in the year 1 CE. There is further great evidence that Matthew, Mark, Luke and John never wrote any of those chapters that are supposedly attributed to them. What historical evidence can be dug up reveals that they were written much later, not at the time that Jesus supposedly said all those things, but somewhere around 30 to 50 years later by a person or persons unknown. Furthermore, when we compare the first 4 books of the Gospel with each other, which supposedly tell more or less the same story, we find that they contradict each other in so many details that one need only read them for himself to pick them out. I neither have the time, the space, not the inclination to go into all these contradictions. They are too numerous. Still, no Bible at 300 CE at this time. The Christian movement, although purportedly nearly 300 years old, still did not have a written text or Bible. Under the powerful and dictatorial direction of Emperor Constantine, a convocation of church fathers was called at Nicaea, a town in Asia Minor. At this meeting a number of scripts and writings were dragged together and a heated controversy ensued over a period of several months. Many writings were considered, discussed, argued over, and reviewed. Some were revised, some were rewritten, some were rejected. The final package that emerged from the Council of Nicaea was what was called the New Testament, a contradictory, demented conglomeration of far-out nonsense. To it was patched the Jewish Old Testament. The Christian movement now had a Bible, with Constantine as final arbiter. When the gathered bishops would or could not agree, he would threaten to bring in his army, which was standing by 238 outside, to enforce compliance. Ready to crush all opposition, Constantine exercised the full powers of his position, financially, militarily and in terms of legal enforcement, to now promote Christianity and crush all opposition. Christianity was now on its way. Jews concocted Christianity. Where did the ideas of Christianity come from? The Jews, who were scattered throughout the Roman Empire, have been mastermind manipulators of other peoples from the earliest beginnings of their history. They have always been at war with the host peoples they have infested like a parasite. When during the Jewish Wars of 68 to 70 CE, Rome put down the Jewish rebellion in Judea and leveled Jerusalem to the ground, the Jews were thirsting for revenge. They were looking for a way to destroy Rome, the Roman race and its total empire. They had tried military opposition and failed miserably, being no match for the superlative Romans. They looked for an alternative mind manipulation through religion, and they found the right creed in a relatively unimportant religious sect called the Essenes. The Essenes, nevertheless, the evidence is overwhelming that these ideas long preceded the Christian era, and it was not Christ who came out with them but a Jewish sect called the Essenes who lived on the border of the Dead Sea. It was they who already evolved the ideas contained in the Sermon on the Mount but have been attributed to Christ. Not only had they evolved the same ideas as set forth in Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, but the wording, the phraseology and the sentences were the same, and they preceded the supposed time of the Sermon on the Mount by anywhere from 50 to 150 years. The Essenes were a Jewish religious group living in approximately the 1st century BCE and the 1st century CE. We have important sources of their contemporary writings in the historian Josephus and also in the philosopher Philo. They are also mentioned by various other Roman and Greek writers of those times in which their religious teachings are revealed in considerable detail. However, in the last 20 years the thousands of Dead Sea Scrolls, many of which were written by the Essenes themselves, reveal a tremendous amount of insight into their religious teachings, and above all, reveal that they preceded and preempted the Sermon on the Mount word for word, so that the so-called new teachings of a figure supposedly appearing from heaven in the year 1 CE, and preaching during the years 3 to 33 CE were neither original nor were they new. Furthermore, we learn that the Essenes were notable for their communistic society, their extreme piety and purity, and their practice of celibacy. They possessed all their worldly goods in common and looked upon private property as an evil which might divert them from sanctity. They engaged in agriculture and handicrafts, considering these occupations less sinful than others. They also practiced baptism, and this practice preceded the Christian era by at least 1–3900. So the Christian apostles can hardly be credited with having instituted ritual of baptism, as is claimed. Why, the average reader might ask, haven't we been told more about these saints if they were the original practitioners of Christianity? There are two good and overriding answers for that. The Christians on their part, although the early Christian fathers were well aware of the Essene teachings and writings, took every measure possible to destroy them and purge them from circulation. The reason being they did not want their presence known because it would undermine their dogma that Christ was the originator of the new teaching. It would make impossible the claim that this was a great new revelation sent forth by God himself amid the hosannas and singing of angels. The Jews, on the other hand, did not want to reveal the presence of the Essenes because they wished to completely hide any connection between the Jews and the new religious teaching that they were about to administer unto the Gentiles. They even went to great lengths to appear hostile to it. Before I go further into the highly illuminating and highly interesting Dead Sea Scrolls, I want to make just one further point, that is that the original manuscripts in which the New Testament supposedly based is always alluded to being translated from the original Greek. Since the New Testament repeats over and over again and again that Paul spoke to his flock in Jewish and that Jesus spoke in Jewish and that the apostles were Jewish, why, then, is it that the manuscripts were all in Greek? The historical facts add up to this. The Jewish hierarchy and undoubtedly the whole conspiracy was well coordinated and had many members and co-workers. It was not written at the time of Christ at all, but the movement was given great promotion by the combined efforts of the Jewish nation. As they organized and promoted their ideas further, these were reduced to writing considerably later than the years 30 to 33 CE, when Christ supposedly came out with these startlingly and new revelations. The conclusions are that they were written by Jewish persons whose identity we shall never know, and were written collectively by many authors, were revised from time to time, and not only in their original formation and formulation but have been revised time and time again throughout the centuries to become more effective and persuasive propaganda. However, we want to go further into the teachings of the Essenes and who they were and why their particular teachings were pounced upon by the Jews to be formulated into a well-distilled poisonous brew and then fed to the Gentiles. The Dead Sea Scrolls, which are more numerous and much more revealing than the Jewish press of today has informed us, tell us much about the teachings and life of the Essenes. One of the important things that they tell us about these Saints is that they vanished from the face of the earth after about 2 centuries of existence, and the termination date being somewhere around the year 100240 CE. They were, needless to say, only a very small sect of the Jewish tribes and no a part of the Jewish conspiracy as such. Being outside of the mainstream of Jewish activity and thought, the Jews nevertheless observed from them that this kind of teaching could ruin and destroy a people. The Jews, looking for a way to destroy the Roman nation, who in the year 70 CE had destroyed and leveled Jerusalem to the ground, noted well what these teachings were and decided to perpetuate them on the Romans. Essenism was really a revolutionary new form of social order, an ideal cooperative commonwealth in miniature. Instead of the Messiah, the ideal of the Essenes was the teacher of righteousness. They established a new cooperative communitarian brotherhood, and they were the first religious society to establish and observe the sacraments of baptism and the Eucharistic meal. Furthermore, the teacher of righteousness as promulgated by the Essenes may not have been the first pacifist in history, but he was the first to implement his pacifist theories with an overall practical measure, which if generally adopted, would abolish war. This, of course, was a wonderful religion for the Jews to sell to the Romans, for if they convert the Romans into submissive pacifists they could certainly soon thereafter dominate them in full, and this they did. The Essenes lived in the area of Qumran near the Dead Sea, and according to Philo, the Jewish philosopher and writer contemporary of that age, the Essene Brotherhood would not allow the manufacture of any weapons or allow within their community any maker of arrows, spears, swords or any manufacture of engines of war, nor any man occupied with a military avocation, or even with peaceful practices which might easily be converted to mischief. Not only does Philo tell us about the Essenes, but also Josephus and Pliny, both contemporary historians, tell us much about the Essenes as mentioned before. Much is emerging also from the study of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The overriding fact that emerges from the study of the writings of the historians of that time and the Dead Sea Scrolls is this tremendously significant fact, namely that the beliefs, teachings, and practices attributed to Jesus Christ, although not exactly identical in all respects with those of the Essene school, were nevertheless closer to those of the Essenes than to those of the bishops of the Ecumenical Council which determined the Nicene Creed of Orthodox Christianity. So we can come to the obvious conclusion that the Christian beliefs and doctrines as supposedly enunciated by Christ in the Sermon on the Mount did not originate at all at that time, but at least 100 years earlier from a Jewish sect called the Essenes living near the Dead Sea, that the elders of Sanhedrin recognized this teaching as being deadly and suicidal, that they further took this doctrine and distilled and refined it into a working creed. The Jews then, with a great deal of energy and Tremendous amounts of propaganda, in which they excel, promoted and distributed this poisonous doctrine among the Romans, setting this creed down in writing in what is now called the New Testament, evolved over the next several centuries. It was written by persons unknown to us today but undoubtedly of Jewish origin. 241 Furthermore, to give it a mystical and heavenly sent deification, they invented the person of Jesus Christ, and claimed that he was the Son of God. Then, having laid the groundwork for this new church, they consolidated that power at a meeting in Nicene, where the creation of the new church was solidified, the creed formalized and given official sanctification. Thus, in short, was launched the new church and the new religion of Jesus Christ, which was fabricated out of thin air. Not a single trace of the Jesus Christ personage can be found in authentic history. Nevertheless, this newly fabricated hoax of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, this idea, with all its suicidal doctrines, was soon to pull down in ruins the great Roman Empire and the great white civilization that went with it. Never again did the white race shake off the control of the Jews. Never again did the white man regain control of his own thinking, of his own religion, his own finances, nor his own government. Unto this day the white race has not regained control of its own destiny. Death of the Romans. We all know what happened to the Romans shortly after they were converted to Christianity. With their instincts deadened and their thinking perverted into worrying about the spooks in the sky instead of struggling for their own survival and advancement, they soon shrank into oblivion. They faded from the scene of history. They paid the penalty of allowing themselves to be mongrelized and not recognizing their eternal enemy, the Jew. Such are the consequences of not recognizing your enemy, and, of course, you can't defend yourself against an enemy. You can't.